All right, let's start. You've probably already heard of this by now, but earlier this week, an article was published on behalf of Meghan Markle in Us Weekly in what was, in my opinion, a downright childish, embarrassing attempt at rebutting the Hollywood Reporter's Dictator in Heels article. I'm serious, you gotta get a load of this thing if you can. I won't be reading it because I've already lost enough brain cells reading it once, but I will be linking it if I remember. But the first thing that occurred to me as I read through it, with a look of abject incredulity plastered on my face, was that famous scene from Mean Girls, the one where Regina George is screaming the house down, literally. It's basically Meghan acting like a high school drama queen who, after getting her fragile ego wounded by being called a nasty bully, rounded up all her friends in a line in the playground so that they can come out one by one and sing her praises with saccharine platitudes and with what I imagine to be a proverbial gun to their heads, just to prove that she is indeed the most popular, the most lovable girl boss in the history of girl bosses ever. Which is really funny because a lot of these statements that are in support of her are from ex-employees, some of whom have barely spent a year or a year and a half. So if it was so good, if she was the bestest of the best, why did they leave? This type of behavior isn't anything new, of course. Ever since Meghan's debut on the world stage in 2016, she has saturated the media with rebuttals and testimonials from her friends whenever her paper-thin skin felt the most fragile vibration of criticism getting blown her way. Her knights in shining armor included George and Amal Clooney, Gayle King, Hillary Clinton, Anna Wintour, Serena Williams, Abigail Spencer, Patrick J. Adams, and pretty much every single talking head from her Netflix reality show. And of course, we cannot forget the now infamous 5 anonymous friends that Meghan fought so hard to keep anonymous, who conveniently had connections to People magazine. Abigail Spencer. Friends who Meghan thought she would sick on her own father after he came out and complained about how nasty her letter was to him in August of 2018. But the lady doth protest too much, methinks. And FYI, Meghan, if a story is not true, then just sue. That sounds good on a t-shirt. Or you could, just ignore it and not dignify it with a response. Thousands of celebrities do it every day. Heck, even nobodies like me do it. As the saying goes, if you lie down with dogs, you get fleas. No offense to dogs, you're amazing. But seriously, doesn't she realize that the more she responds, the more ex-employees are gonna come out of the woodworks and call her a demon? I'm not even making that up. After this rebuttal from Us Weekly came another article in response to that one, seemingly, where she was elevated or demoted, I don't know which way we're going here, from a dictator in high heels to an actual demon. And did she learn her lesson after that? Of course not. Because after that, she comes out through In Touch Weekly this time, basically declaring that this is war. After I'd read the initial Us Weekly rebuttal and the wave of secondhand embarrassment had dissipated, my mind shifted to how abnormal this entire situation really is. I mean, think about it. This is a 43-year-old woman who was incapable of moving past any criticism, whether small or significant, without rounding up her friends like hostages and making them stick their necks out for her by singing her praises. Notice how she never directly responds to criticism. She probably thinks she's too high and mighty to do that. And we've always talked about how transactional her relationships with everyone are. And we've definitely talked about how cult-like her Sussex squad is, but we've never really touched upon the cult-like dynamic that exists between her and her so-called friends and employees at Archewell. I mean, one of them literally said in the Us Weekly article, "If you come for our bosses, you're coming for us. This isn't a criminal organization." Okay, I don't recall anyone accusing Archewell of being a criminal organization. I don't recall anyone accusing Meghan of being a criminal. That's P. Diddy. I mean, I think you've got your cult leaders mixed up here. But in all seriousness, that's not a normal response either. If someone comes for your boss, you're coming after us? I'm sorry, I don't know what kind of a relationship you guys have with your boss, but I don't think a lot of us feel that way about our own bosses. I just want to go home and not hear from them again until I have to go to work again. The thing is, you don't have to have an official cult to behave like a cult. And it's not a coincidence that throughout the years, people have been making a lot of comparisons between the way Meghan Markle behaves and the way cult leaders like Charles Manson behaved. Now look, obviously she pales in comparison to what he did. And I am in no way alleging that she is the equivalent of a crazy lunatic mass murderer, don't get me wrong. But I couldn't help but look into the traits of what make up a cult leader and notice more than a few concerning, striking parallels. We all know that Meghan Markle is all about that power and control. And according to cult intervention specialist Ashlyn Hilliard, cult leaders are notable for the enormous amount of power they have over their group. And considering Meghan, along with Harry of course, is literally the boss, the head of Archewell, we know this is true. There's an obvious imbalance of power between her and her employees who came out singing her praises in this scenario. So because of this imbalance of power, they have to play by her rules. When it comes to control specifically, and we all know Meghan Markle is a self-confessed control freak, Hilliard says cult leaders often have a strong need for control and may exhibit authoritarian behaviors, such as dictating the beliefs and actions of their followers. Coercive control is a pattern of behavior used to dominate, intimidate, and manipulate someone. This can include a range of tactics, such as isolating the victim from friends and family, monitoring their movements, controlling their access to money and resources, and using threats or physical force to maintain control. I have no proof, obviously, that she is doing any of these things to her employees. But we know that she isn't exactly a stranger to isolating people she wants to control from their friends and family. She did it to her husband. We also know she's not a stranger to intimidation and threats. I mean, her whole career after the royal family consists of intimidation and threats. So if she's doing that to her husband and her in-laws and even her own family, then who knows what she's capable of doing to her own employees. I've always heard this one about Hitler and even Charles Manson actually. Basically, cult leaders tend to be quite charismatic. They are described by experts as being highly persuasive and possess a magnetic personality that can attract and influence others. And it's arguably the most important trait because it's actually the one that lures people into your web. I personally see right through these types of people, so it's difficult for me to consider the likes of Meghan as charismatic because it's so obviously fake.
Was he nice?
But I can see how she can dial up the charm and trick people before her mask eventually falls off, because it always does. And when you look at people like Gayle King, and Hillary Clinton, and Serena Williams, and the Clooneys, and everyone else who came out guns blazing for her in the early days, I guess you could say that they were charmed. I personally think conned is the more appropriate word, but even King Charles was said to have been quite enamored by her in the early days when he first met her. Now, this statement by cult expert Stephen Hassan really hit the nail on the head. He says, "They say the right words, but it's not genuine. It's acting." And a more fitting description of Meghan Markle there never was. It's basically love bombing. You know, it's a narcissist's playbook, a classic trait that we talked about extensively when covering the Netflix series a couple of years ago, because Harry had basically described, in Spare as well, how she love bombed him. It's what they specialize in. You know, they make you feel like you're the most important person in the universe, like you're the only one who matters. And they seek out people who are susceptible to that, Prince Harry being one of them, usually people with issues or low self-esteem. And that's also, surprise, surprise, ding, 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 what cult leaders tend to do. I do want to quickly say that not all charismatic people have the potential to be cult leaders or secret cult leaders in a different life. But if you know someone who's very charismatic and you're concerned, then another cult expert by the name of Alexandra Stein says to focus on what they're using their charisma for. So are they doing it for good or for bad? And this one's really telling, how they respond to criticism. When it comes to Meghan, I mean, we all know that she uses her charms to get what she wants, everyone else be damned. And as for her response to criticism, it's more something like this. You guys, the further I delve into this research, the scarier it gets. Listen to this. Cult leaders are not able to tolerate being wrong, nor do they want to have to take any responsibility for having wronged you. They tend to answer to no one and live by their own rules. It's their world, and others need to learn how to exist in it. Did they just study Meghan Markle and pretty much come up with all this research? Because that's how it's reading to me. It goes on. They often feel they are above the law, are beyond reproach, and enjoy shaming those in the group who defy them, disagree with them, or, in essence, hurt their ego in any way. Spot on. What else can I say? This week's Us Weekly article, the hundreds of People magazine and Marie Claire's and Vanity Fair articles, the saccharine platitudes that she constantly forces or makes her friends to make publicly in support of her. All of that is because in her mind, she cannot be wrong. She has to have the final say, and she will not stop, as we are seeing right now with this In Touch Weekly article being the latest. I'm sure there'll be more by the time this video goes up, until she feels that the record has been corrected according to her standards. This one I found particularly interesting because it's not an overt trait that cult leader type people display, but it's a childhood wound that festers and manifests later in life. Mental health professionals have recently found a correlation between cult leader type people and an insecure attachment style in their early childhood. So think an absentee parent or a neglectful parent, maybe even an abusive parent. And so what happens is they end up having this developmental gap where their sense of self would be had they had a secure attachment to their early caregivers, being their parents. So it says here, they're always trying to compensate by getting people's attention or feeling power over others because they felt so helpless as a child. Now, the reason this is very interesting to me, other than the fact that it's not an overt trait, is because we learned from Tom Bower's Revenge that Meghan was a very lonely child whose father was constantly working, constantly busy, long hours, Hollywood, and whose mother basically disappeared for a decade of Meghan's life. And I'm sure that impacted her. And it's quite a revelation because I personally never made the connection between her parents' absence or, lack of attachment during her childhood and her current behavior. Because she always seemed like a spoiled brat who always got her way, daddy's little princess. It's actually quite sad, but I will say that once we grow into adults, I firmly believe that it's up to us to become aware of our shortcomings, our issues, and try our best to fix them, rather than ignore them or let them fester, deny their existence, or just fall into that victimhood mentality of, it is what it is. But I also understand that, unfortunately, the Meghan Markles of the world, and believe me, there are plenty, I know at least 5, will never get better because in their minds, they're absolutely perfect. There is no problem, there is no wound to heal. The problem lies with us. Exploitation, also known as using people, something that Meghan Markle could actually write a thesis on. Hillard says cult leaders may exploit their followers financially, sexually, or emotionally, using their position of power to gain personal benefits at the expense of their followers. They exert undue influence on followers, meaning they pressure or persuade people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do and that often run counter to their own best interests. Now, I'm not saying that Meghan Markle coerced or forced or exerted undue influence on her staff members and ex-staff members to sing her praises. And it might be completely off their own volition, but from my admittedly short experience on this planet, It's not exactly the norm for private individuals, private citizens to want to put their names out there in the press along with their faces and defend their very infamous, notorious, problematic boss, knowing that said boss gets a lot of criticism. I don't think normal people want to involve themselves with that. And I'm just gonna say, someone like Meghan, who definitely has the power to influence people to get her way, how else did she get into the royal family from nothing? It's really not that far-fetched to say that she may have exerted such influence on her employees. Again, I can't prove it, I'm not saying it as fact, but if the shoe fits, which is a really ironic thing for me to say, seeing as her shoes absolutely never fit. The final two traits I want to mention are quite inextricably connected, being malignant narcissism and grandiosity. And it's interesting that malignant narcissism is included by experts as a trait, because I feel as though every single trait we have described is under the umbrella of malignant narcissism or narcissism in general. But generally speaking, many cult leaders are malignant narcissists. Those who have sociopathy and simply do not care about the pain they inflict, the damage they cause, and the lives they derail in order to get their very powerful ego needs met. They are insatiable in their neediness, and no amount of devotion and sacrifice ever quite feels like enough. Now, I'm not here to diagnose, I can't, even if I wanted to, and say that Meghan is a malignant narcissist, but any person who is aware of narcissism, and I'm not saying narcissistic personality disorder, I'm saying just narcissism, knows that Meghan Markle is really high on the narcissism spectrum. And I read Valentine Lowe's Courtiers, and the way that the staff described her, and Harry to be fair, was that nothing was ever good enough. You solve one problem, they come up with another and another and another, and they're never grateful for the efforts that their staff put in. I believe it was Edward Lane Fox did his best and succeeded in talking to Ravek and securing 24-hour police protection for Meghan whenever she visited the UK at least. And this was just when she was a girlfriend. She wasn't entitled to any of this. And guess what? She wasn't happy. She wasn't satisfied because it took 2 months to action it rather than instantly, which is what she expected. And get a load of this. I think this one is very, very fitting. They often use doing charitable work or speaking about caring about others as a way to come across as loving. But ultimately, it's a way to launder their reputations. If that isn't an accurate statement about Meghan Markle, I rest my case. Again, not saying she's a cult leader, but she certainly acts like one, in my opinion. It goes on. Malignant narcissists don't often come with an ethical core that drives them. They don't think about how to make a difference in the world, which is ironic because that's all Meghan talks about, but rather craft a world where they are the gods and others are to live their lives doing good for them. I don't know the lady. I've never met her in person, but based on what I have observed over the past few years, this really lines up with her behavior and her expectations. And I think that's why she gets so wounded and so enraged when people criticize her, because she sees herself as a deity above us all. How dare we even look at her, let alone criticize her actions? In terms of a sense of grandiosity, I mean, I think that one is self-explanatory, but in general, just to connect this with the research, when someone is beguiled into a cult, they're working for the good, the pleasure, or narcissistic needs of the cult leader. But they're often told their work has some higher purpose and they're going to find meaning and happiness in a way they've never had. I feel as though this really reflects that statement, that really strange statement by the employee who said, if you come after our bosses, you come after us. You know, there's that sense of they've been fed this story, this image of greatness that they are a part of, when in actuality, what on earth is Archewell even doing? I mean, they talk about meetings and she's stomping around in high heels, and I'm here scratching my head going, meetings to do what though? They have no work, they're not producing anything, all they do is take photographs and hijack events that are set up by other organizations, where Archewell basically inserts itself as a last-minute sponsor or partner of the event. But I digress. Cult leaders also tend to get drunk with the power of being the Pied Piper. As their following grows, so too does their self-importance and their craving for even more admiration and attention. And that is another common narrative that I've seen about Meghan Markle that I've noticed personally as well, which is her narcissism got worse when she married Prince Harry, but I'm sure even when she started dating him. I'm sure that the person that she was before she dated him was a more restrained version of the true narcissist on the inside, because she had to play nice. She wasn't anybody on the world stage really, and she had to make people like her, charm them to get her way. But once she got the ring on her finger, the monster came out. That's when she started walking in front of Prince Harry. That's when she started really misbehaving and treating staff poorly. She did treat them poorly before the marriage, but it really escalated after. And that's when it really got to her head. I mean, you can see it in the wedding. You can almost see her head growing. So, it appears that Meghan Markle ticks virtually every single box that came up in the research, which is really scary and concerning, but also, I'm not saying she is a cult leader, but she certainly behaves like one. And I have to say, after this Us Weekly article, her staff are behaving like followers who have been either brainwashed or coerced or exploited or manipulated or whatever you want to call it into sticking their necks out for her, which again is not normal behavior. None of this is. And I also want to say while we're at it, just because someone gives you gifts or is generous or is kind at times or pretending to be kind, that doesn't mean that they're not also all the bad things that other people are saying. I don't understand this notion of my perception is the only perception that is correct. She's good to me, therefore she is objectively good. All of her employees, I'm assuming, are adults, and they should have been on this planet long enough to learn that people wear masks. People can lie, people can pretend. Of course, the longer you spend with them, the longer you get to know their true colors, which is probably why most of their employees don't last beyond 18 months. What's happening here is the actual original Sussex Survivors Club from the UK are basically being called liars all over again. Their stories being questioned all over again. Their experiences are being negated all over again. And we all know if they weren't true, Meghan would have sued. She and her husband are not strangers to litigation. It remains to be seen if she sues this time, but she would really be opening a can of worms if she does, because I've mentioned this before in the podcast, discovery, witness testimony if it gets to trial. She really would be starting a war, so she'd better tread carefully with her next move and how she handles this, because it's really ironic that she keeps resurrecting it with her responses. If she would just let it die, if she would just ignore everything and move on, then the public would have completely forgotten about the Hollywood Reporter's article by now, because there are other things that are happening in the world. It's not just about Meghan. People are consumed right now with the P. Diddy case, for instance, or the elections. But according to Meghan, she's the center of the universe, and nothing we can say or do is going to change that. All right, that's it. Finito. Ciao.